Hello, and welcome to Unpublished Opinions, an Institute for Justice roundtable podcast, the podcast where IJ attorneys get together and give their unvarnished and unpublished opinions about the law. I'm your host, John Wrench, the Assistant Director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice, and we are recording this episode on July 30th, 2026. And I am joined today by my colleagues, Kirby West and Josh Wyndham. Kirby and Josh, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, John.
So some big things have been happening in Pennsylvania in the realm of private property and government surveillance. And both Josh and Kirby have been involved in that. And Josh, you're probably still in the afterglow of a recent victory where the PA Supreme Court unanimously overruled one of its precedents and rejected the so-called open fields doctrine.
I like the so-called.
Yeah, we can maybe chat about that at some point. So-called, just as a note, is a good thing to add when you are questioning whether something maybe exists or giving yourself some distance from it, which the PA Supreme Court definitely did. They rejected the open fields doctrine under the state constitution, which has a bunch of implications for statutes that allowed officers of the Pennsylvania Game Commission to enter private property, posted or otherwise, without a warrant. And Kirby is representing a client in a Fourth Amendment challenge to a statute in the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Code, which allows waterways conservation officers, which are also known as fish cops, to enter upon any land or water in the performance of their duties. So Josh, could you start by telling us a bit about your case, what the court held, what that meant for the statutes that were challenged there, and then maybe we can chat about how any of that might bear on the other case about the fish cops.
Yeah, we represent two hunting clubs in Western Pennsylvania who have together over 5,000 acres of private, beautiful forest land up there sort of in the, it's the mountains. I would say you would call it, West Coasters probably wouldn't call it the mountains, but I call it the mountains. And it's really just gorgeous private land. People treat the land out there as a sanctuary. They've got it posted and purple paints up on the trees, which signifies no trespassing under state law. They've got locked gates. They've planted rows of trees to put up privacy shields. I mean, this is like really secluded land by design. And when you visit it, it's just gorgeous. They're wonderful stewards of the properties. And so they want privacy. When members of these clubs are going there to hunt or vacation or hike or just enjoy time outside, right? And as you said, there were statutes on the books that authorize state game wardens to go onto these properties without a warrant, regardless of the fact that they were posted, and just kind of fish around for evidence of hunting violations. And they didn't have to have probable cause to do that. They could just sort of go on patrol, as they like to put it. And that resulted in, at least on the record we built, at a minimum, 22 warrantless entries of the properties that we were aware of. The problem is they didn't keep records of their entries. And so we were just kind of going off their memory in a lot of cases, or evidence they happened to keep. They also put a camera on one of our clients' properties that was up for 78 days and took hundreds of photos of people, which members were quite outraged by. And so all of this led us to arguing with the government about whether Pennsylvania's constitution follows the so-called open fields doctrine, John. And as a matter of federal Fourth Amendment law, the open fields are unprotected, and they are really any land outside of what's called the curtilage, which is this like ring of land around your home that, whether it's curtilage or not depends on a set of factors from a case called Dunn. Maybe Kirby will get into that a little bit. But the point is, we were arguing that Pennsylvania's constitution doesn't follow this distinction between open fields and curtilage, that all private land, as long as it's posted or otherwise marked as private, deserves constitutional protection from warrantless searches. We were asking the court to reject both federal law on that front under the state constitution, but also to overrule a 2007 decision called Russo that basically just said that we would lose the case, right? It said we follow the open fields doctrine under our state constitution, and so that's that. And we were successful. Obviously, we got the court 7-0 to overrule the Russo case and reject the open fields doctrine. And, it's a very long opinion, so there's a lot we could talk about in it, but I'll just say maybe 3 things about it. The first is that as a textual matter, the court found it really important that the state constitution protects possessions from unreasonable searches. And if you go back to the founding and look at all the sources from dictionaries to statutes to like really early state high court decisions, everybody talks about land as a possession. It is ubiquitous in the history. So that was a really good point for us. The court also noted, and I think this is really important, that at English common law at the founding, trespass was illegal, right? And so, you had a right to exclude people from your land. And although the colonists changed the English rule a little bit, through positive law. The English rule was that like whether your property was posted or fenced or not, it was sort of like enclosed in the eyes of the law. And so any unwarranted intrusion onto that property, even if it was truly an open field, was still a trespass. The colonists were trying to settle, right? And so they were trying to encourage people to, roam over land and move out west. And so they adjusted that a little bit by saying, if you want to exclude people, put up fences, right? Make your property enclosed in the physical world, right? But nevertheless, you retained a right to exclude. And Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, look, that's important. It's an important part of our history that we retained this English common law rule and adapted it to meet our circumstances with these like posting norms, right? And so those were 2 like really important aspects of the decision, the textual and historical points. But what's notable for I think our discussion today is that the court was willing to strike down these warrantless entry statutes facially. And, this question of like facial versus as applied relief is one that comes up in so many IJ cases. It comes up in public litigation all the time, or public interest litigation all the time. And I think courts are just really confused by it. So I'll just start by saying, and I want to get you guys' thoughts on like your own experiences with this issue or your own thoughts on it. But the court was willing to say, look, this statute authorizes warrantless entries of private land, posted or otherwise, right? And so the court's point was, we can't conceive of a circumstance in which that statute would be constitutional because, and I'm putting words in the court's mouth at this point, but because basically, whether you post your land or not, they have the authority to do this, right? So there's nothing you can do as a landowner to avoid the warrantless searches. Like they have the power to do it, whether you put up a sign or a fence or a brick wall, right? And so that, I think that to the court was pretty compelling. And that was the reason the court was willing to strike down the statutes facially. But, in our other cases, we've seen courts do things a little differently. So do you guys want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I think the most obvious analog, because it's cited in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, a concurrence in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision in your case, is our fish cops case. So as John previewed, we have another case in Pennsylvania involving warrantless searches. This one not related to the Game Commission, but a separate statute that authorizes the Fish and Boat Commission, aka, as John said, fish cops, to go on any land or water in the performance of their duties. And crucially, unlike the statute that governs the game wardens, which has been now struck down thanks to Josh's amazing work, this had no qualifier at all. So it did not say except for curtilage like the game warden statute did. So by its terms, the statute said that these fish and wildlife conservation or fish and waterways conservation officers could go on to any land or water in the performance of their duties. And that's just what they did. In our client, Tim Thomas's case, he had 2 separate incidents of warrantless searches on his property, including the curtilage. And I don't even think, Josh, we really need to get into what constitutes curtilage, because by any possible definition on existing federal case law on curtilage, they went on Tim's curtilage. So they went right next to the house, past a window where his then wife was taking a bath, onto his covered back porch. I mean, just areas that are, essentially touching the home, which by any possible conceivable definition of curtilage would constitute curtilage.
As far as curtilage goes, this was not a hard case.
It was not a hard case, yes. And so on the motion to dismiss, the Pennsylvania the agency moved to dismiss, and their motion to dismiss was denied in part, but it was granted in part because we brought both a facial and as applied claim. And our facial claim was actually dismissed because the court said they could imagine situations in which this statute could be used constitutionally. So for instance, under the Fourth Amendment so-called open fields doctrine, the court could imagine that an officer could go onto the open fields, which are not protected under the Fourth Amendment in the court's view, and that would be a constitutional exercise of this statute. So the court only allowed our as-applied claim to go forward. So going back to Josh's case, to the Pennsylvania open fields case, a concurring justice said, listen, I agree with the court that what happened here was unconstitutional, and I agree with the court's analysis of what the Pennsylvania Constitution means, how far the protection goes, as Josh just explained. However, I can imagine in some instances where, for instance, the property is not posted, where there isn't that purple paint that the hunting clubs used in our case, and it's just there's no indication that this is private property, that it would be constitutional, even under the more protective Pennsylvania Constitution, for the game wardens to enter that property without a warrant. And for that reason, I think we should have decided this only on an as-applied basis and not facially struck down the whole statute. And I think that I don't think that was a crazy read of our case, the Fish Cops case, and the district courts. Obviously, a federal district court is not binding on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which this justice also noted. But the read of the distinction between facial and as applied law, there's plenty of basis for that in the federal case law on what does it mean to have a as applied versus facial challenge. And you often see language like, no possible constitutional application of the statute, which is a really high bar if that's the one that the court is going to adopt. And so I do think they are a little bit at odds, and that I would say, because you were entitled to facial relief, which I do also think was justifiable, I think the Fish Cops case, we also probably should have been entitled to facial relief. But we'll, continue trucking away, and I hope get relief on an as-applied basis instead.
It's just, I want to note that I just think it's important that you said it's a completely reasonable take on things by Justice Todd's concurrence, because I have found myself as an attorney litigating these kinds of cases, wading myself through the case law and trying to understand the facial as applied distinction to come up with arguments for, if we had good arguments, we would make them. And if we didn't, we should just admit that. But what you come to find when you dig into this is that even the courts are frustrated with the lack of clarity about what this distinction is and how it should cash out in different cases. So, when the law is that squishy, it's up to you as an advocate to push it in the direction you think makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that what happened in your case, it does make sense because it's such a high bar to say no possible constitutional application of a statute. You can think of a pretty restrictive and just oppressive statute that would still have an occasional conceivable constitutional application, and I just don't think that is what the court should be doing when they are considering whether or not a statute is constitutional. It's so deferential, and it leaves statutes that in 95% of their applications could be unconstitutional on the books, which is, I think, problematic from a sense of our constitutional system and constitutional jurisprudence. I think the big takeaway for lawyers, though, and I also find this area of law confusing, Josh, is bring both. You should always bring both. If you're going to be challenging the constitutionality of a statute, you need to assert both as applied.
Yes, and I know you're champing at the bit, John, because of the bring both point probably. But just to clarify for listeners who maybe aren't lawyers or just are coming at this for the first time or hearing about the facial as applied issue for the first time, like what does it mean? Traditionally, the U.S. Supreme Court has described this distinction as having to do with the scope of relief the court will issue. Right. So what that means is if you're seeking to have a statute declared unconstitutional as applied, that means the court will issue a declaratory judgment that, at least with respect to you or your property or your conduct, the statute can't constitutionally be applied. If you're seeking what's called facial relief, you're asking the court to say that not just for you, but for any conceivable, to use Kirby's language, to use any conceivable application of the statute, that's going to be unconstitutional too. And Kirby's not just making that up. That comes from other U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And so, when we're talking about facial versus as applied, it's how broad is the court going to go in granting relief against this statute? And that maybe leads us, John, to talking about the Iowa rental inspections case that you did.
Indeed. So this is a rather unfortunate ending story, but we litigated a case in Iowa under the Iowa Constitution, under their provision that's kind of the state constitution's analog to the Fourth Amendment. And we challenged a city's rental inspection program that gave the rental officers the ability to go into renters' homes without a traditional warrant. And I say traditional warrant because there is also something called an administrative warrant that the U.S. Supreme Court essentially invented in a case called Camara. And a administrative warrant does not require probable cause in the traditional sense. You can kind of look at an area, identify all of the properties as rental properties. You can make it basically an area-wide inspection program, and your so-called probable cause in that situation would be the fact that there is a rental property, which is not how we think of probable cause normally. Normally, probable cause is some kind of evidence of a violation of the law that you can tie to a person or a property or something like that. And so we challenged this program as essentially allowing suspicionless and warrantless entries into people's homes just because they were renters. And the strange thing, so we won in the district court, and then or the lower court, and then we went to the Iowa Supreme Court, and the Iowa Supreme Court rejected the challenge in large part because the court could imagine applications of that ordinance where it was not suspicionless, and it would not pose a problem under the state constitution. And so this is kind of connected to what we've been talking about, and it also might be why the facial as applied thing is particularly strange in the search and seizure context, because and we were chatting about this briefly before we started recording, if you think about the kind of founding trauma that led to the Fourth Amendment, which was really this kind of the use of writs of assistance, a form of general warrants to promiscuous searches, the laws authorizing them, you could have looked at those laws and ended up conducting a search that was not promiscuous. You could have gotten someone's consent. Maybe you would have had probable cause. And so it's kind of strange because that kind of law still hands the government a loaded gun, and they can choose to use it in a way that maybe is constitutional and maybe is not constitutional. And it just seems to me like that giving the government that power is facially unconstitutional. Like that seems a problem. To use the example that Josh was talking about, you might have some pieces of land that are painted and some that are not, but the law doesn't itself distinguish between that. So if you're the officer reading that law, on its face, it does not tell you that there is some kind of restriction, right? Like it doesn't tell you that you can only go on posted property. So the fact that you may end up wandering into property that's not protected just doesn't seem like it should save the statute.
Yeah, I mean, the court, let me put it this way. When I was deposing the game warden who did most of the warrantless entries in the Punxsutawney Hunting Club case, I asked him, like, just straight up, I was like, when you're doing these patrols without a warrant, do you think of or treat posted land, fenced land, marked land any differently than you would unmarked land, unposted land, or even public land? And he just said no, right? Like, to his mind, the statute gave him authority to just treat all land the same, which means no warrant required, right? And like when that's the mentality that your statute gives the officers, that mentality is the constitutional harm, right?
Yeah, it does seem like there is so much constitutional avoidance kind of baked into this idea that there can't be any imaginable constitutional application of the statute. But I really don't see how that, I mean, if the court were maybe more explicit about that really the facial standard is about constitutional avoidance, and it's kind of a fiction, but the reality is that the statute as it's written, if it's not construed in a different way, is facially unconstitutional. I think that might be different, but I think that is quite different from saying that the statute is facially not a problem because you can imagine it being used in ways that are not are constitutional.
I think that's right. And I also will just say, we've kind of hinted at this and that the case law is confusing on this, and courts themselves seem confused about the difference between facial and as applied unconstitutionality in statutes. But just as I said that Justice Todd, the concurring justice in the Punxsutawney case, was not crazy. Like, we are also not crazy. Like, there, to be clear, there is case law and there is language from courts taking a different view that's more aligned with what we think on terms of facial challenges. And that's where you get language like the statute has to have a plainly legitimate sweep, which can mean a lot of things, but I think a statute could not have a plainly legitimate sweep and be facially unconstitutional, even if you can imagine a constitutional use of that statute. So you'll see that kind of language in cases that cut both ways sometimes on the facial as applied distinction. But I do think it is a little bit at odds with this other language that you see a lot, which is talking more about, can I imagine a possible constitutional application of the statute?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's odd is that what's often going on in IJ cases where you bring a facial and an as-applied claim, which you typically do, is you have a client who has like a real distinct fact-specific injury to them, right? That gets you into court. But then you say to yourself, well, the reason we brought this case is that, in fact, our client is not unique. Mm-hmm. Like, there are a lot of people who are in our client's shoes.
Right.
And so, like, it would be unjust for us not to ask the court to help all of those people too. Like, if, your client is one of 1,000 who are suffering the same constitutional harm, the court shouldn't just stand by and allow those other 999 people to suffer that harm in perpetuity, right? Like, it's the job of the court to do justice and to enforce the Constitution. So, and it would be weird if, like, the fact that there were other people outside of that set of 1,000, who didn't have injuries could be enough to somehow insulate the government's ability to keep hurting those other 999.
And it's not just us who wants that relief, right? Of course, our clients work with us and take on these cases, which I'm sure we've covered on this podcast before, but can involve years of their life and all kinds of challenges. And they take on that fight because they want to prevent this from happening to other people too. So this is, it is, I think you're right, the province of the judiciary. Like, this is what the courts should be doing. And it's also what the litigants and basically everybody wants them to do.
Except the government.
And I mean, it's such a messy area of law. And I think, our conversation has made clear that there, at least in the way that the courts have discussed it so far, has kind of created that mess. And there are situations where clearly a law as it is written allows a certain form of abuse across a huge population.
Can I say one more thing on this, which is I think this area of the law also tends to highlight the fact that different rights are sometimes treated different ways by courts. So, like, if you're in the First Amendment space, courts are often much more willing to declare statutes facially unconstitutional, in part because of the concept of, like, chilling speech, right? The idea that people will self-censor if the government wields a kind of censorious power. And, like, there is no such thing right now in the law that I'm aware of courts talking about, like, Fourth Amendment chilling. But, like, that is the thing about general warrants and writs of assistance at the founding, right? Is it, like, they were damaging to the people whose properties were invaded, sure. But the bigger concern the colonists had was, like, you're striking fear in all of our hearts by giving the government this authority to just kind of come in whenever they feel like coming in. And that is a kind of chilling, right? But, courts haven't quite recognized the Josh Wyndham Fourth Amendment chilling theory yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet. I mean, and this will transition into the next thing we're going to chat about through this, I think, because you could say that in any situation, taking the Fourth Amendment, for example, any situation where courts have increasingly moved toward, and I'm thinking of the Supreme Court specifically here, toward being concerned about the standing machinery of surveillance, that's in one way kind of a chilling concern, right? Because it's not I'm not going to wait for you to use this against every single person to know that it as a standing machine, it is actually super dangerous. So in a sense, that's, maybe they are kind of moving towards this idea that at least in the Fourth Amendment space, that the capacity to do the constitutional harm is actually extremely dangerous.
I feel like you have to talk about Chatry now.
We'll get there. So we'll move on, I think, to the standing machinery of surveillance, where big things are also happening. And one of the big things that's happening here is there's been a lot of coverage that our listeners may have seen in the news about specifically automated license plate readers, which are a computer-controlled camera. They are mounted above ground level or on police cars, and they automatically capture license plate numbers that come into their view. Those images are then typically transferred to a computer or server, which then uses optical character recognition software to convert the image into a license plate number, and that record also captures the location and time. And then that can all be stored on a database, which the government can access retrospectively. And you can do that with just one ALPR camera, and if that doesn't sound bad enough, you can imagine what you can do when you have a bunch of them, where the government can create a precise retrospective database of any of those movements. And the government can do all of that, at least up until today, through today, the government can do that without a warrant. So if you're thinking to yourself, that sounds like it might be super vulnerable to abuse, you may have also seen in the news that there have been a bunch of police officers who have gotten in trouble in different states, specifically and most recently Georgia, where a bunch of police officers have been arrested for misuse of an ALPR databases. Actually, it's kind of difficult to get the number exactly because the number over the last 2 or 3 weeks of those officers has increased. So initially it was reported it's 10 or something, and then so it keeps going up. But they've been arrested for abusing these ALPR databases, including stalking or following where their spouse is, where their partner is. One of my favorite details from CNN's coverage in particular was that one of the officers who was investigating the abuse was themselves abusing the database. So, what is someone to do if they don't like ALPRs, or this kind of freaks them out? And one option, which I'll kind of call the Batman approach, is to go around and personally destroy them, disable them, which was also in the news. A guy in Suffolk, Virginia, is alleged to have destroyed a bunch of flock ALPR cameras specifically. Another one, also in the news, another option is a legislative approach. You may have seen that Congressman Thomas Massey said that he'll be introducing a bill to withhold federal funding from cities that deploy ALPRs. Another option is to file a lawsuit. And I was wondering if, Josh, you could talk about our Norfolk case and maybe ALPRs. And I know you mentioned Chatry, so we'll probably have to talk about Chatry a little bit too.
Sure. I want to make clear for listeners that when John was describing these, quote, options, he was not endorsing them all.
Oh, yeah.
The point is people are taking different approaches and responding in different ways, some more aggressive than others, to the proliferation of, warrantless ALPR surveillance. And
we are not condoning surreptitiously disabling and destroying ALPRs over a period of years.
No, but the point is people are having very visceral reactions to them.
I also do not condone this. However, I was reading a Reddit thread on the story about the veteran who was destroying flock cameras, and all the comments were essentially versions of, "It couldn't have been him. He was with me at that time at my church." Or like, it was, let's say, not outrage at the action that he took, we'll say.
Yep. So Chattree. We don't have to go too far into the details of Chattree, but the highlight, I think, worth flagging here is that the court was willing to say that government accessing people's cell phone location information, in that case, it was through what's called a geofence warrant, which is the government going to a judge and asking for a very loose kind of warrant.
If you could, a so-called warrant.
A so-called warrant to search people's basically Google location history information and data.
And just as a note, this was a case that the court decided just at the end of this term, Chattree versus United States.
That's right. And so the courts below were divided, and the judges below in the Fourth Circuit were divided on the question of whether accessing people's location information from their phones, and in Chattree's case, I think it was like 2 days, right?
It was actually only 2 hours, I think.
I'm sorry, 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah, my bad.
Yeah.
2 hours of data, and whether that's a search under the Fourth Amendment. And in order to figure that out, the court applied the Katz reasonable expectation of privacy framework, which asks two questions, right? Do people have a subjective expectation of privacy in the thing the government intruded on? And was that expectation reasonable? And in Chattree, the court says, yes, in your location history collected by your cell phone, it's reasonable to expect the government's not going to go in and access like a historical ledger of where you've been collected by your phone, whether they're doing that for, a 2-hour period or the longer period that was at issue in the Carpenter case from 2018 involving cell site location information. So the court has been on a pretty distinct trajectory over the last 10 years in pushing back on mass surveillance, recognizing that there are meaningful Fourth Amendment limits on mass surveillance, even of your public movements, which I think was previously more of an open question in Fourth Amendment law. And all of this leads us to ALPRs, right? Because although the Chattree case and the Carpenter case were about data collected by your cell phone, about where you've been in the past, automated license plate readers are collecting a database of data points on where your car has been photographed. And the more cameras a city has, the more data points there's going to be. But the point is, that's all collected automatically in a centralized government database. Officers can search that database at the click of a button. It's really easy to pull up a vehicle journey map for John Wrench in a city that has ALPR cameras and say to yourself, where has John been this month? Where has he been going? And can I kind of figure out what his patterns are? And as you noted, this raises the possibility of abuse, right? People stalking their exes with this technology, people harassing folks with this technology. There's actually a high, IJ just put out a video about this, but there's a high rate of misidentification with these cameras and people getting pulled over or arrested when they actually are not the person the police were on the lookout for. So the cameras have a questionable hit rate. And I guess all of this leads me to what do I think about the three options that you flagged? I'm not an advocate of the tear down the cameras as a vigilante Batman type of thing.
Approach.
Although I will note, John, you mentioned our Norfolk surveillance case. We have a Fourth Amendment challenge to a network of over 170 automated license plate readers being operated without warrants.
That sounds like a lot.
All over the city of Norfolk. It's one of the highest percentages in the country per square mile for a city. Norfolk is pretty high up there. And, when we filed the case, one of the things that we got in deposition from one of the city's officials was just a gem, I thought. People, when the cameras started going up, were hitting them with bats to turn them around so they wouldn't face the road. And again, I'm not an advocate of that, but I think it definitely demonstrates that people expect privacy from this kind of dragnet surveillance, and they're willing to hit the cameras with bats to, affirm their privacy rights.
Yeah, just to like stop on that for a moment, because I'm also not condoning the Batman approach, but I do think that there is
Batman in two respects.
Nice. I think that there is something very telling about that kind of public reaction to something, because it is a bunch of people who are putting themselves in potential legal trouble for something that they are freaked out and angry about, which there's like a tension here. On one hand, we're not, you can't condone the Batman approach, but also we are a nation whose history is steeped in outrage against government abuse that took early forms of vigilante.
I mean, the Boston Tea Party.
Vigilante
exactly.
reaction against government abuse. So there is a kind of there's something there that I think has always remained, which is and we'll get to the other approaches, but like there is something that has always remained there, which is a kind of willingness to, at the end of the day, kind of prevent the thing from happening. Now, that's not to say that people should start with the Batman approach, but I think that it is telling that there is a deep concern that has remained very rooted in the kind of American ethos about mass surveillance.
Yeah, I think this is like worth pausing on even further. I think this is such a great point, because one thing that I do think is important for people on our side of this sort of debate is to just acknowledge that there is a cost to this, right? And in the Chatry case, there was actually a bank robbery of well over $100,000 at gunpoint. I mean, that is a very serious crime, and it would have been easier for the officers to be able to engage in surveillance to find the bad guy who did it. And this is true of even more serious crimes, of course. And it is just a truth that the Fourth Amendment does make it harder for law enforcement to catch bad guys in some really serious and tragic cases. But the thing that's beautiful about American history is that I think from the founding generation on, we have maintained that trade-off is worth it, right? Our liberty is precious, and it is worth paying that societal cost to ensure that we can be free from oppressive government surveillance and, the kind of overreach that the founders were worried about, and talking about writs of assistance and general warrants and things like that. And I think that it is important for each generation to continue to grapple with that analysis. And I am encouraged. Again, I also think that the way to challenge it, and part of the reason I think the way to challenge it is in cases like our Norfolk case and, engaging in speech. Part of the reason it's so important to engage it in the courts and in the public sphere in speech is to make it clear to people that that's what's happening, is that we're engaging in this balancing between, we don't like crime, but also our liberties are so precious, and articulating why that is a core part of our constitutional system and our values in our nation, and doing it, with words rather than with actions can be more effective in that way. But I do think that these kind of vigilante incidents do show that does remain, and that our current generation of Americans still feels that importance.
Yeah. The thing that came to mind when you were talking was, anyone who has kids, or like if you're from the education space, you'll know, and we've all been in school too, like as little kids, there's always a problem kid in class, right? Like there's like one like class clown or jokester, like someone who kind of like can take up most of the teacher's attention, right? And I think of this as like playing to the lowest denominator. Like it can't be that we should set all the rules in our society, including the way we think about our Constitution, because there are bad apples out there, right? Because the fact is, we live in a society with a presumption of innocence. Like most people are just ordinary Americans going about their lives. They're not guilty of crimes. They don't deserve mass surveillance. They don't deserve to be treated like criminals or suspects on a constant basis.
Or be surveilled by their partner who happens to have access to the database.
Right. And so like it is true there are bad apples. It is true there is crime. It is true if police have to get warrants to investigate those crimes in a lot of circumstances, that's going to make it harder to catch the bad apples. But like most of us are innocent here. And like we don't deserve to be made casualties of the fact that there are some bad apples out there. And so I agree with everything Kirby's saying. The other thing I would just say to kind of stick to your spine, John, of like the three options. So we've talked about
You're
the
getting
Batman.
back to your roadmap.
Yeah, getting back to my roadmap. Ever the advocate, John.
Yeah.
We've talked about the Batman. We don't condone it, but we are, following. I take heart in the fact that people are upset about the mass surveillance at a basic level. We have litigation going on in the Norfolk case, also in San Jose, out on the West Coast, and that's making its way through the courts. But the Norfolk case is in the Fourth Circuit right now, and it's fully briefed. And this is going to be the first major federal appellate case to involve an application of Chatry, like right after Chatry is decided, right? So we are on ground zero of making the law in this area and pushing the law in the right direction.
Ground zero also in another interesting way that Chatry came out of the Fourth Circuit. Right. And as I think you mentioned that the Fourth Circuit, I don't know if you mentioned that they went en banc, but they went en banc and split very, very deeply in Chatry. And so it's interesting that this is going up to them.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a circuit that I think has been really at the cutting edge of this stuff for a long time. So even before Chatry, there was a case called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
Which couldn't be a better case name.
Incredible case name. But it was a case about warrantless aerial drone surveillance over the city of Baltimore. And it was, ongoing surveillance of people from the air over an extended period of time. And the court was willing to say, like under the Carpenter case about cell site location information, yes, these aren't cell phone data points, but they are like long-term tracking of people's public movements and creating a kind of database of that. And like the court was unwilling to tolerate warrantless surveillance of a city, as the court phrased it. And I think that's what's going on in Norfolk, right? There's warrantless surveillance of a city. It is dragnet by definition. And like it's the same thing going on from the ground that, Baltimore was doing from the air. So I think, again, the Fourth Circuit is such an interesting place to be for these kinds of cases. It really is sort of the tip of the spear. But you mentioned legislation too, and obviously, Massey has his potential bill coming out. IJ has a model legislation about this called the PEEPS Act, and it is, really designed to give cities and states a legislative option for, how do we constrain this kind of warrantless mass surveillance? How do we rein it in? What kind of guardrails can we put in place that would actually put like real teeth in the limits, as opposed to just kind of like head nodding to it? I think a lot of the legislation you've seen so far has not gone nearly far enough in requiring a warrant for this kind of surveillance.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned about the dragnet nature of it, and we've been kind of circling about this, is I do wonder how much the shift in technology has just made it unavoidable for courts to deal with the fact that these aren't cases where the government has identified a person and has attempted to either track the person or do some kind of targeted surveillance, which I think are easy. I'm not saying that, courts have still struck down abuse in those situations, but I think it's harder to avoid the consequences of such a large scale system and that it impacts normal people, right? Like you can often, I think, view a case as, could the justice imagine themselves being tracked in this situation? I don't think most justices imagine themselves in the kind of criminal context that many of these cases involve. I think that they can imagine getting caught in a geofence. I think they can imagine being tracked by an AOPR. And I think that allows, them, I think it allows litigants to kind of make this more about the public. And I think it also helps to reframe the Fourth Amendment as something that protects Americans. And it is often instead kind of framed as something that's like a right of criminal procedure. And it's not really that. And I think this has kind of shifted how people are talking about it right now.
Or he got off on a technicality. Like that kind of association. Yeah.
I want to just make one more point for folks to chew on. Like I think Kirby alluded to this about, there's a real trade-off here, and in some of the bad guys can, get off free. it's worth thinking about how effective, even as a policy matter, this kind of mass surveillance is as a crime detection or crime prevention tool. One of the things that you'll see in marketing materials from the leading ALPR vendors out there is that, like, we want crime-free cities, right? We imagine a crime-free world. Let's a camera on every street corner, and that'll be the path to salvation here. And when you look at a city like Norfolk, where there's such a high percentage of cameras per square mile, it's interesting to see that, as cameras have proliferated in Norfolk, you haven't really seen like a significant drop in crime. Like I read a report the other day about the difference between 2015 and 2016 crime stats, or whatever the last year measured was. I forget whether it was 15, 16 or
25, 26.
I forget whether it was 25, 26 or 24, 25. But the point is, the last year that was measured in Norfolk, there was an increase of 64% in homicides and 26% in auto theft. And like, these are the kinds of crimes that you'll see the major ALPR vendors touting that they can help prevent or solve, right? So that's really interesting to me. And then, of course, Atlanta is a big kind of epicenter of some of the, one of the major companies that offers these services. And it's, kind of ground zero for that company. And there's thousands and thousands of cameras across the Atlanta metropolitan area. And, when the cameras sort of started proliferating in 2021, I'll give you a couple examples. Criminal homicide, 2021, the clearance rate for that crime, right? So when it was reported, how often could they solve it, was 53.4%. In 2025, after 4 years of cameras exploding, it went down to 48%. So the clearance rate went down as cameras expanded, right? Or think about like auto theft. So here's one, 9.9% in 2021. It only went up to 10.2% in 4 years and thousands of cameras later. So are we really willing to, accept, thousands and thousands of cameras watching us at every moment in the city of Atlanta for a 0.03% increase in, motor vehicle theft clearance rates? That really puts things into sharp relief for me.
Yeah, there is something, and I think it's something that we kind of run into across a lot of our cases, which is in different areas, not just the Fourth Amendment, where there's a sense that if you can just exert a little bit more control or a lot more control over people's freedom, you can achieve something akin to utopia. And you just need a little bit more surveillance. You need a little bit more control over speech. You need whatever the thing is, a little bit more control over property. And once you do those things, you can reach this utopia. And not only factually, I think, as Josh is pointing out, that's extremely suspicious. But it also is, as I think we were talking about with the American spirit, is we have been willing, and I hope we are willing every generation, as Kirby was saying, to resist that proposed trade-off. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a switch away from surveillance. And if you're the kind of person who ever had nightmares about grades, you might not like this, especially if you had nightmares about law school grades. We recently learned that from one of our Dave Kennedy fellows, and that's IJ's paid, if there's any talented law students out there, IJ's paid summer fellowship for talented law students. And we heard from one of our DKF fellows, Zach McClure, that Yale Law School just added a mandatory curve this past year. The first semester, it's fully pass-fail. After the first semester, the scale goes honors, pass, low pass, fail, but it's pretty rare to get anything below a pass. The change is that there's now a 40% cap on H, those are the honors grades, in each class with more than 15 people. And that Yale Law School is unique in that they only have one semester of required courses, and they choose their classes from the first semester on. The only required classes are contracts, procedure, con law, crim law, torts, and a 5-week research and writing class, and everything else is up to the students. There's no required statutory interpretation or property. A lot of that sounds quite foreign to my law school experience, and I'm curious about what you guys think about that. But across the board, just the grading. It's interesting to me that this is what the grading is shifting to, which makes me wonder what the grading was before that. And even that is a bit foreign to me, and certainly the absence of something like statutory interpretation or property. So what do you guys think about those changes?
So my first read on it was that this is sort of part of, you see this in some other universities, especially in undergrad, I think, of an effort to combat runaway grade inflation. I assume that that's what was happening at Yale and why they wanted to put a cap on the honors grades given out, that they probably were a lot of them given out. And I think there's a tension with the I'm sure with the school between wanting to give as many students as possible like a good credential and have them be competitive for jobs, and a desire among employers, particularly in the law school case of judges, of having a desire to be able to distinguish among candidates from a given school. But I think in general, it is like combating grade inflation is good because for lots of reasons, like people who are genuinely excelling should be recognized as compared to their peers. And also there should be incentives for people to work hard in school, not least because they should want to learn something. Like they should want to be engaged with the material and try their best. But I think it is a little interesting at Yale combining that new policy with the lack of required courses, in that there is, if you're cynical, sort of a incentive for students who want to have the best possible grade outcome to avoid black letter law classes, which for our non-lawyer listeners are typically those over 15-person courses that are mentioned. So like black letter law courses are the ones that you think of as classic to the law school experience, like classes like property, con law, torts, and these are the classes that you picture in like Paper Chase or something, where they're, Socratic and just this sort of really classic law school experience. And the classes that are under the 15-person threshold are typically more what I like to call the law and feelings classes. They're classes that have titles like law and something, like law and, man's engagement with the environment or something. I
had one that was like philosophy of international criminal law, yes, which I loved, by the way.
They can be wonderful. And so, they can be a great experience for law students. But I think if you're going to law school, you should take as many black letter law classes as possible, because that's how you learn to think like a lawyer, at least to the extent you can do that in law school. I think you're going to get more out of your black letter law classes than to be fair, incredibly engaging and valuable in other ways, law and feelings classes.
So the reason I thought this was interesting when Zach mentioned it was just that. So I came from a law school where you're graded on a curve, and and I hated it. I hated the experience. I hated feeling like I was against my classmates. Like, aren't I here to learn and just become like the best student I can be and like do the best at learning the law that Josh Wyndham can? And it felt so strange to say to myself, like, oh, if I study with this group, am I helping them like beat me on the curve? Or like that just felt so bizarre in the academic world to like see others as competitors or enemies or something like that, where it was like zero sum. So I don't think that's super conducive to like a great law school experience in terms of just the relationships that you build and the way that you approach the task of learning. The other thing, setting aside my own experience, that my reaction to the thing Zach said about how it's working at Yale now was like, I don't get what the point of all this is. Like, it felt convoluted as described. And I'm like trying to figure out, obviously Kirby flagged some of the balance that maybe they're trying to strike there between grade inflation and some of the expectations that like employers might have for being able to distinguish between, high performing and low performing students. But it feels like we really should figure out for ourselves, what is law school supposed to be doing? Like, is law school just another step in the kind of filtering or winnowing down mechanism of deciding who the best of the best are? Right? Because like by the time you get to like Yale Law School or Harvard or any of the kind of bigger law schools, like you are pretty smart. Like you've gotten good SAT scores, you did well in college, and like now you're in law school, and we're just going to keep filtering people down until, you know, we find the diamonds, right? Like the best of the best of the best. And is that the goal? And if that's the goal, I get why something like a pure curve is like the thing to do. Like I actually don't grasp why you would do it the Yale Law School way, where you kind of split the baby, like just do a pure curve and be honest about it. If that's not the goal, if the goal is just let's all learn and let's all figure this out, and like we want to, as Yale Law School or Chapel Hill, where I went, we want to just say to ourselves, hey, the students that we give degrees to, we are confident that they know the law well enough that we can put our stamp of approval on them. We can signal that to employers and to the students by giving them a diploma. Like pass-fail might work, right? Or something like a standard grading system without a curve might work, right? But this like splitting the baby thing, this mishmash hybrid thing that Yale Law School seems to be doing, just struck me as like signaling confusion about the goal of the enterprise.
So I'll push back only slightly, which is, I think that that is the competitive nature is true about like academic exercises traditionally, like undergrad as well. A lot of classes have historically been graded on a curve. And I think, I think we probably don't need to feel too bad for any of the Yale Law students. Like even the ones who aren't going to be in the top third of the class, they're all going to get good jobs. Like, well, for many of these schools, it's like, you know, I'm dating myself here, but when I was in law school, also graded on like a, you know, honors or pass system, and the saying was then straight P's, 160 G's, because that was the starting salary at the big law firms then. So, you know, we don't need to shed too many tears for any of these, you know, top law school students. But I totally take your point that the purpose of law school should not be just like, oh, there's one kid who's actually just the best in the world. Like, I don't think that's how it actually plays out. And
it's not like the Olympics.
Exactly. Yeah. But that said, I think when you look at law schools beyond, you know, the very top few, the grading system does give exceptional students a way to distinguish themselves. And I do think some employers would say, like, you know, I would rather a kid who graduated in the top 5 from this law school, where maybe they didn't get into the top, you know, 10 law schools, but they really excelled at this law school. And I'd rather, personally, this is how I would feel as an employer, I would rather that kid than someone who went to one of the top law schools and didn't really care and didn't try that hard, you know? And so I think it does create some opportunities for exceptional students who, for whatever reason, you know, didn't opt to go to or didn't get into one of the top law schools, to distinguish themselves and prove that they can do it and can compete with those kids. So
it's so curious because it creates this kind of like two societies thing of students, where if you get into, you know, like one of the schools where you will never have a problem, like the fact that you graduate from the school means that like you kind of have a certain kind of stamp. You've been vetted in a certain way. You will be able to get that job or whatever. It's funny that in that circumstance you do need less of a way to distinguish that person like from the other students. And it is also true that it is helpful if you're a student at one of the other schools to be able to work very hard and end up distinguishing yourself. But it is kind of, it creates such a strange dynamic because it basically means that if you can work really hard and you're smart and you can get into one of those schools, you can then kind of relax a bit. And
it depends on what your goals are, right?
Sure,
but yeah,
sure.
yeah, definitely.
Right. Like, I mean, it's not like you can relax in the sense that like you don't do anything or whatnot. And of course there are going to be people who, and many of those people will continue excelling because they are driven people, which is what got them there in the first place. But it is interesting that like you have that track, and then you also have a track where someone who gets into law school at one of those other schools, basically like they have to be able to kind of get vetted in a similar way. They have to outperform everyone, almost everyone. It's just very interesting. It's like you either have to prove it earlier or later. And it's very strange. And I agree with Josh. This is, for Yale to be doing this, seems a little strange.
Yeah.
Like it's not unwelcome in the context of trying to fix grade inflation, but it is also like, what exactly is
what's the
this
difference
doing?
between the top third of the class at Yale and the bottom third? It's a valid question.
And also, that those statistics of the 40% cap on age, that's still a lot. That's a lot of students in the top 40. Like that's a top 40% essentially still getting right. Like that is a strange. Like I'm not sure what.
Maybe they're trying to acknowledge that fact that we're slicing it pretty thin here.
Yeah.
But no, it's fair. All valid.
It's an interesting thing. I think, as I think Kirby said when we started talking about this, there's been a lot of stuff in the news and signaling about grade inflation and concerns about like undergrad grade inflation, law school grade inflation, stuff that Josh was talking about with like, what is law school about? And I don't think that conversation is going anywhere soon. Like all the conversations about like how long should law school be and what is it about? And
my perception, just like kind of, incidentally, is just that undergrad grade inflation is really, really bad. Yes. Like it's actually like quite bad comparatively to law school. And that like that's a serious problem that probably warrants more attention than grade inflation in the law school context. But
definitely.
I'm also confessing, like with some of the way I've approached this conversation, just like the fact that I hated the curve, and like I just I don't know, I would have rather had an experience in law school where I felt more comfort in just like the shared enterprise of studying with classmates and stuff like that.
Yeah, you kind of have to adopt the like Don Draper thing where he says, I don't think about you at all. Like if you're going to be able to avoid a feeling of competition, you almost have to be, which I don't know if that's possible, but you almost have to think of it as like I'm doing this because I love it. I'm doing it for the love of the game, not to win. But I don't think that that's how it actually feels to be in law school when you're getting graded on the curve. So all right. Well, Kirby and Josh, thank you so much for being on the show. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Please be sure to tune into our next episode. And until then, that's just like your unpublished opinion, man.
But